Hello, everyone. Welcome to Consent 101, brought to you by Aspect.ca, which stands for Advocating for Sex Positive Education and Consent Culture. Before we get going today, I just want to acknowledge how privileged I am to be presenting to you today from Treaty 6 territory. I invite you to do your own exploring into your own relationship with colonizing ideas about society and maybe unpacking those and being able to support land back. Our organization is a nonprofit. We are governed by an elected board. Nobody here gets paid. We're all volunteers. Our whole mission is to support sex positive values through workshops, socials, and events with the overall goal of reducing intimate partner violence. So consent is one of our favorite topics to discuss. My name is Angel. I use they, them pronouns. I'm one of the original founders of the organization, and I continue to support it all these years later as a sometimes on the board, but always as a volunteer and as a sex educator and sex coach. All right. So what is consent? Lots of people will define it as permission for something to happen, or an agreement to do something, or a conversation around what is allowed to happen and be within everybody's boundaries. Simple enough, right? Either we give permission or we do not. Either we got permission or we did not. It is simple, but when we add sex, it seems to complicate things for a lot of us. But it is also very important to make sure that we understand that consent is a whole process when it relates to sexual activity. Consent is the foundation of sex, and it's an element that's missing in sexual violence. And that's a direct quote from Consent Ed. So this is the model that we prefer when we're talking about consent. And let's explore what these different things mean. We like it fries, it's easy to remember. So freely given means that a person feels more than comfortable to say no. They're saying yes because they actually want to say yes. They're not afraid of the consequences of saying no, and therefore they're able to say yes freely. Revocable means that no matter at what point in time it is during a sexual interaction, they have the right to remove consent. And the ability to remove consent has to be there throughout. If at any time they no longer have the ability to remove consent, for example, they fall asleep, then consent is automatically revoked. Informed means they know exactly what they're consenting to. So for sex, for example, if a person's consenting to sex with a condom, they're consenting to sex with a condom under the understanding that that condom is on properly, being used throughout the sexual interaction. The removal of that condom is the same as the revoking of their consent. Enthusiastic means the person actually wants to say yes. They're not saying yes reluctantly, sarcastically, resignedly, but instead are like, yeah, I would like to do the things. And specific means that consent is restricted to the exact things that were discussed and consented to. Nothing more, nothing in time more, not for more people, just exactly for that act, that time, those people in that place as per discussed. So it's a very concise consent, and it is a lot more than just a no. So I have some true and false questions for us to explore to help us get a better idea of what consent actually means in our day-to-day lives and our relationships with people. So some of the things that we often hear in society is that no means no, unless it means yes. And that the only way to recognize consent is if somebody verbally and clearly says yes. That asking for consent is awkward. We also hear rumors that it's common for people to say they didn't consent after sex, even when they did consent. And that we don't need consent for a live-in partner. That we have consent for one sexual act, we should be able to go to other sexual acts without much discussion. So let's explore each of these, shall we? No means no, except when it means yes. This is false. Hopefully you'd already guessed that. It's really important to recognize that when we're respecting someone's boundaries when they say no, that's exactly what we're doing. If they actually mean yes, the burden is on them to let us know that they were just being funny, they're being sarcastic, or they felt uncomfortable saying yes, whatever the scenario is. If someone actually means yes, that's on them. This myth comes from an old fashioned idea about sex and consent and empowerment, in which women were shamed for saying yes and therefore they needed to be coerced. This is very victim blaming and sexual assault supporting. And it's an idea we need to really challenge in ourselves and other people and just generally in society. It also discounts the very real reactions that people can have if they're engaging in some sort of intimacy and something unwanted happens. It is very common for someone to freeze, and therefore only a yes is yes. Only enthusiastic, reciprocated participation in the sex act is a yes. And the moment any of those things change, a person goes silent, they go still, they stop reacting, or they start to look like they're afraid or uncomfortable, that is the removal of consent. And everyone else needs to stop, check in, and leave room for that person to feel comfortable to say no. So while listening when we're told no is super important, and we don't want to disregard a no, consent requires that we get an enthusiastic yes. And the moment that enthusiastic yes is no longer present, neither is consent. Recognizing consent. I often hear that it's hard to recognize when somebody is consenting or not consenting. So we're going to watch this video together. And then once we've watched it, we're going to talk about whether or not it was easy to recognize consent.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure. I have to get up really early. I actually remembered I have to pick up my brother's friends, nephews.
Or we could go bowling.
Actually, I'm not feeling really great right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I said not right now.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I've never done this before. Whoa, put your pants back on. I think we're ready.
Amazing. So when you watch this video, most people found it quite easy to differentiate between a yes, a no, and a couple of times where it felt a little ambiguous, in which case you should check in and say, I can't tell whether or not you actually want to do this. And it's totally okay if you don't. And I'm not comfortable proceeding unless I know for sure that you also want to proceed, right? Uh, Otherwise, you get a smile, you get the body language that seems playful and engaged, and you get the verbal or other sort of body language yes, or you get uncomfortableness or hesitation or fear or upset or disconnect or an outright no. I often hear that asking for consent is awkward. And I understand that having to risk somebody telling us no means that we're also risking that feeling of rejection. I would like to reframe it though. I I found it a lot easier for me to ask people and to risk rejection when I started to reframe that as making it safe for people to have boundaries around me. Instead of thinking about it as a rejection, I view it as them letting me know what's going on for them. And sometimes it might not be about me, and sometimes it is, and it's not really my business why they said no in the first place, right? Like that's theirs to hold and to have. You know what's really awkward is doing something, being afraid to ask the person if they want to do those things and just kind of doing it and hoping for the best, and finding out after that they didn't feel safe, that you did something that made them feel coerced or worse, assaulted. That's awkward. One of the key myths about sexual assault is that people consent to sex, but then after they're embarrassed or they regret it, and so then they withdraw their consent after the fact, when in fact research across the board indicates that the gross majority of sexual assaults are unreported. So where does that myth about false reports come from? It's steeped in misogyny. It comes from the idea that people, particularly women, are in a constant state of consenting, but then are too embarrassed and withdraw consent to ruin a person's life. As we find more gender equality in society, I'm also seeing this myth being turned against men, where it's assumed that men, of course, wanted everything, and so therefore could not ever be in a state where they're not consenting. However, the false report myth is predominantly placed on women reporting against men. And it's really unfortunate that this is something that society really wants to cling to, and I invite you to challenge it. There is data collected by Statistics Canada and Universal Crime Reports that shows that false reports are very, very, very rare in sexual assault cases. Less than 2% of reported rapes are actually deemed false. And most of those false reports are actually made by parents of teen daughters, or in when someone's like accusing like a stranger, saying that somebody jumped out at them as a way to explain the state they're in when they come home. That's a study you can go take a look at by Brennan and Taylor Butts at 2012 study. From this, we also know that the person who instigated sex may not hear the words that indicate the other person was not consenting until after the fact. They're too excited and they don't want to pay attention. We're not socialized to think about people that way. And that's a whole nother problem that needs to be unpacked, because we need to be thinking about the other person we're touching. We're not entitled to that touch. And from this, we can assume that if a person were engaging in sexual touch with freezes, or their enthusiasm suddenly, goes down, they need to check in. And if at any time we are not 100% sure that they are consenting, we need to stop. You just stop completely and then ask, are you okay? Do you need to stop? It's okay if you do. And don't proceed unless we are 100% sure. Consent in long-term relationships. Even if we are with a live-in partner that we've been with forever, and there are some kinds of touches that they seem constantly open to, it might be a beautiful thing to stop and check in with your partner and be like, every time I come home, I just kiss you. Are you okay with that? Would you like me to ask first? Is there something you would like to signal to me when you're not interested in that welcome home kiss? And the same with sex, any kind of sexual contact. We need consent for that sexual contact. Being married is not consent. Living together is not consent. Sleeping in the same bed is not consent. Cuddling is not consent. The only way to know a person's consenting to sex is to give them the opportunity by asking and then listening to what their response is. Not sure? We ask. Consent to one thing is consent to another thing. I hear this a lot. Well, the person went over there after for nightcap, so obviously they were consenting. But this isn't true. Consent for one thing is consent for that one thing. If someone consents to kissing, they're not consenting to sex. If they consent to sex, they're not consenting to anal. If they consent to anal, that does not equal consent to photography. And consenting to video or pictures being taken isn't consent to them being published. Every aspect of what we're doing with someone intimately needs to be discussed openly without shame, so that they have an opportunity to set boundaries and let us know what they're comfortable with. And even if they do consent to all those things, if at any point they look uncomfortable, we need to stop. We need to ask. We need to check in. The drinking conundrum. So that way we've dealt with the some of the true or false things. What about drinking? I hear a lot that if both people are drinking, then there's no way for one person to be responsible. But the way the law looks at it, and ethically it makes sense, is that the person who's initiating that sexual contact is responsible for two things. One, are they sober enough to recognize consent? And two, is the other person sober enough to give consent? If the answer to either of those is not a resounding and clear yes, then they need to abstain and wait until they're sober. That's just how it is. Think of it about driving. If we were all at a bar together and we hopped into someone's car, when we get pulled over, the person who's driving is the one who would get the ticket, because they're responsible for making sure that they're sober enough to understand the risks they're taking while driving and be able to respond appropriately on the road. The people who got in the car are not the ones that are held responsible. They're not driving. That's the same with sex. So whoever's in the driver's seat from moment to moment, that is the person who needs to ask. So if you're going to kiss your partner, you need to make sure you're sober enough and they're sober enough to consent. If they kiss you back and then they go take off your shirt, they need to be sure that they're sober enough to recognize consent and that you were sober enough to consent, and so forth and so on. Now, the rules in society have changed. So if you're an older person like me, it can really help to look at this with some sort of compassion for yourself and the people who've been in your life. These aren't the same messages that we were talking about 20 years ago, because we weren't talking about consent and sex. And so some of these things you might be going, ooh, I didn't do that. We got to learn from those mistakes and be able to move forward and to be accountable. If you've been doing things that are non-consensual, you need to be accountable for that. There's amazing therapists that can help if you're dealing with guilt and shame over some of your non-consensual behavior, if you want support to really increase your game when it comes to consent. And same for people who've experienced those disempowering violations against their sexual autonomy. There's help. Please reach out. If you're in Edmonton, the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton provides support for people who've experienced sexual assault, and there are lots of counselors that specialize in helping people build their boundaries and communication skills, including around sex and sexuality. It's only a mistake if we're learning from it and if we're able to take accountability and not repeat the same mistake. If we're repeating those mistakes, that isn't a mistake, that's predatory behavior. So let's just summarize our Consent 101. So consent is an agreement where people give permission or agree to certain types of sexual contact. That consent is mandatory. It's not optional. It legally has to be present, and ethically, of course, it does. It's just part of being an adult, being able to talk about what we want to do to make sure that what we're doing is okay with the people we're doing it with. Everyone involved in that sexual interaction has the responsibility to think about their own boundaries, to verbalize them when it's safely to do so, and to make sure that the other person feels safe to verbalize their boundaries. We use the Fries model of consent, which is freely given, revocable, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. If all of those components are present, you're doing good. And then we'd also invite you to add sober to one of your informed parts of consent. We can't be informed if we're inebriated, unconscious, or otherwise impaired. And then, of course, accountability. If we make a mistake, and that happens, you might go to hug an old friend and realize you didn't even ask. We need to take accountability for that. I'm sorry, I should have asked first, right? Stop hugging them, apologize, and then ask if they're okay. and don't repeat that behavior.